8. Abraham Shakespeare. 40-year-old Abraham Shakespeare spent two of his last $5 on lottery tickets at a convenience store in Frostproof, Florida in 2006. The decision took him from being a laborer of modest means to unimaginably rich in the blink of an eye. He won $30 million, taking home a grand total of $17 million after taxes. Shakespeare upgraded to a nicer home in a gated community, but for the most part he kept his spending impressively in check, at least when it came to himself. He bought a Honda and a Rolex from a pawn shop, but he was quick to splurge when someone asked him for help. However, the constant requests for money got tiring, and at one point Shakespeare told his brother that he would have been better off if he'd never won the lottery in the first place. A local businesswoman named Doris Donegan D.D. Moore noticed Shakespeare's growing frustration. She offered to ease the burden by managing his money for him, and because Shakespeare trusted her and thought she had his best interests at heart, he eagerly obliged. He mysteriously disappeared though in 2009, leading his loved ones to wonder if he'd gotten fed up with the stresses of his fortune and skipped town without telling anyone. But they grew increasingly worried when months went by with no word from Shakespeare, and they eventually reported him missing. In the meantime, D.D. Moore had become the proud owner of several new vehicles and went on a vacation. She dodged Shakespeare's relatives, who'd become suspicious of her possible involvement in his disappearance, telling them that she'd helped him skip town after he told her he wanted to escape people's constant nagging for money. In early 2010, a police tip led to the discovery of Shakespeare's remains in Moore's yard. By then, his lottery winnings had disappeared entirely, but it's not exactly clear what happened to all the money. After the remains were found, Moore changed her story and claimed that she killed Shakespeare in self-defense. In the end, she was charged and convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving life without parole. Moore maintained her innocence throughout the case and continues to do so from behind bars. 7. Evelyn Adams. When New Jersey resident Evelyn Adams won millions in the state's lottery jackpot twice in 1985, she found it impossible to avoid the spotlight or resume any semblance of a normal life. The convenience store clerk won a total of $5.4 million, which is the equivalent of over $15 million today when adjusted for inflation. After winning her first prize of $3.9 million, Adams paid bills, bought a new car, set up a college fund for her daughter, and helped friends and family who suddenly came out of the woodwork with their hands held out. She gave away a substantial amount of the winnings and later told the New York Times that the lottery didn't change her, but it did change the people around her. Adams also increased her weekly spending on lottery tickets from $25 to $100, paving the way to a devastating addiction that would eventually suck her dry of nearly every last penny to her name. She initially planned to use the rest of the money, which was doled out in annual payments of around $174,000 after taxes, to pursue an education and better her life in other ways. However, she put college on hold while she waited for her daughter to finish high school and instead focused on remodeling her home. Both she and her fiancé quit working for a while, but her partner soon became bored and got a job. Instead of doing the same, Adams began blowing money on slot machines in Atlantic City. She also made some poor business decisions that ended up costing her a lot of money. By 2012, the lottery winnings were gone, and she was struggling to get by while living in a trailer park. 6. Lobsang Darji. Former Buddhist monk Lobsang Darji began a new life in the US in 1997 after escaping political turmoil in Tibet. He unapologetically clawed his way from the very bottom to as high as he could possibly get on the socio-economic ladder, marrying the sister of tennis legend Andre Agassi. He relied on her connections and wealth as a cornerstone for his real estate empire. With the Agassi name at his fingertips, Darji had an easy time drumming up generous funding from investors. He also benefited from the federal government's EB-5 program, which provides incentives to immigrants who invest in a commercial enterprise that creates jobs in America. Much of Darji's funding came from Chinese investors seeking to establish permanent residency in the US through their involvement with his projects, some of whom sold everything they owned to bank on their dreams of starting over halfway around the globe. However, much of the $240 million in funding that Darji collected was diverted into businesses and failing personal projects that didn't qualify for the EB-5 program. He also spent it on personal indulgences, including a sprawling mansion in Bellevue, Washington, and a Bentley. To cover up any discrepancies and to obtain a $25 million loan to supplement his reckless spending, he falsified bank statements to make the numbers appear like everything was fine. But the Securities and Exchange Commission wasn't fooled, and in 2015, the agency filed a civil lawsuit against Darji and successfully petitioned in court to freeze his assets. Sadly, as a direct result of his misappropriation of funds, his nearly 300 foreign investors' applications for green cards were denied. Thankfully, most of them recouped their funds and were later approved for permanent residency in the States. Darji was criminally charged and ultimately pleaded guilty to 2 felony fraud-related counts. He was released from prison in 2019 after serving part of a 4-year sentence. 5. Andre Rbello. When 58-year-old Colleen Rbello was found dead in her Perth, Australia home in 2020, investigators didn't initially suspect foul play. But they began to second-guess how she died when her son, 26-year-old cryptocurrency dealer Andre Rbello, landed at the center of a fraud investigation. Unfortunately, it was too late to perform a second autopsy. Colleen had been cremated against her wishes thanks to a forged last will and testament that detectives believe Andre is responsible for. Andre is the longtime partner of influencer Gracie Piscopo, whose modeling career has been going strong for years after becoming a social media sensation. And, by all appearances, Andre seems plenty successful on his own. But for some reason, it appears as though he may have wanted to get his hands on his mum's money and assets, as well as a $500,000 life insurance payout. More than 2 years after Colleen's death, authorities charge Andre with murder along with a series of fraud charges. In addition to allegedly forging her will, he's accused of forging medical documents, his mother's death certificate, and a record of investigation into her death. He remains behind bars while the case proceeds, and Piscopo has wiped any trace of him from her social media. 4. Ephraim Divaroli and David Pasas. Working out of a tiny apartment in Miami, Ephraim Divaroli established a small fortune as a weapons contractor for the US Department of Defense. He started his business, AEY Inc., by winning small contracts, and over time he established the reputation he needed in order to start landing larger jobs. By 18 years old, Divaroli was a legitimate, self-made millionaire. He took on a business partner named David Pasas, and in 2007, the pair landed a $298 million contract with the Pentagon to provide munitions and arms to Allied troops fighting in Afghanistan. They soon realized that they bit off more than they could chew when they found themselves unable to deliver everything promised in the contract. Divaroli and Pasas began taking illegal shortcuts to get the job done, namely by using banned Chinese supplies. They repackaged the goods, removed any evidence of their origins, and sent the packages on their way. In the meantime, the young men shamelessly enjoyed the influx of cash that the contract brought them, indulging in cars, homes, designer clothing, and of course, drugs and women. As the business continued to grow, what started out as a respectable law-abiding company essentially became an arms smuggling organization that operated right under the federal government's nose. However, the feds eventually caught on to the scam after noticing a decline in the quality of AEY's products and a growing list of contracts that it had failed to follow through on. By sending junky equipment and failing to honor deadlines, the pair showed not only a disturbing level of greed, but an unconscionable disregard for the safety of Americans serving overseas. Around the same time, Pasas and Divaroli's business relationship became strained, creating the perfect conditions for them to act against each other in a legal case. Pasas was the first to flip, and he ended up pleading guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States. He served 7 months of house arrest in exchange for his cooperation, while Divaroli received a 4-year prison sentence for the same charge. 3. Alex Lazarev. Childhood was rough for Alex Lazarev, who was raised outside Toronto by a destitute single mother who suffered from volatile mood swings and other issues. He ran away at 15 and periodically came back to visit in hopes that his mother had changed. However, he was left disappointed every time and continued to bounce back and forth between the streets and youth hostels. Alex was just 18 years old when his mother passed away, leaving him with mixed feelings of grief and relief after struggling for so many years with their painful relationship. He later wrote in The Guardian that he was shocked to learn that she quietly stashed money away and invested in real estate while they lived in what seemed like abject poverty. He also found out that he was to inherit $1 million. Overnight, Alex went from living in squalor to living in a luxury penthouse. He later wrote that at his age, he had no business handling the amount of money in his possession. In addition to blowing it senselessly, he naively helped out anybody who asked and made some miscalculated investments and ill-conceived business decisions that ultimately resulted in major losses. He also bought a car for a stripper who, in his words, didn't stick around long. As Alex slowly began to realize that money doesn't grow on trees, depression set in. 4 years after receiving the inheritance, he essentially ended up right back at square one, on the streets. Since then, he's carved out a stable living performing comedy around the world, recounting his traumatic experiences with a healthy dose of cathartic humor. 2. Graham Roos. To some people, $750,000 isn't a lot of money, but it was more than a small fortune to 26-year-old Graham Roos, who came from a working-class family and inherited the funds in the early 90s from a great aunt who'd married into wealth. Even before his aunt passed away, he struggled to hold jobs because he knew money was eventually coming his way and apparently planned to live off it. Roos was even more thrilled when he received the inheritance, and it was a lot more money than he expected. He blew through the money at an alarming rate, spending it on lavish vacations, a luxury flat, drugs, and privately chartered flights. In a refreshingly honest article for The Independent, written 2 years after he received the payout, Roos admitted that he'd stupidly squandered his inheritance and that a lot of it was spent on entertaining people who probably didn't even genuinely like him. When he realized that the money wasn't going to last forever, his mental health began to spiral out of control. Roos finally came to the conclusion that he'd taken his newfound fortune for granted and that he had little, if anything, to show for it. His self-esteem hit an all-time low, while his finances simultaneously plummeted to rock bottom, and he was forced to start over from scratch with a job at a laundromat. But Roos didn't regret the experience. Rather, it taught him about the things that matter most in life, like family and having the basics covered. He was thankful that his parents never judged him for his wanton spending, even though his mum said she knew he would waste the money. 1. Keisha Williams. As the telemarketing industry exploded and showed signs of going nowhere but up, a Virginia woman named Keisha Williams jumped at her chance to get a piece of the pie. She solicited loans from investors, telling them about the state-of-the-art software she'd purchased that would facilitate remote doctor's visits at a time when such a thing barely existed. Williams explained the software was being held in escrow in Austria until she paid taxes and fees on it, and promised investors a 30 to 100% return on their money. Many people pounced on the chance to take advantage of the unheard-of rate and forked over as much money as they could afford. Altogether, she raised around $5 million. But Williams only put a small portion of the funds towards the software. She blew most of it traveling the world, eating at fancy restaurants, and on luxury designer clothing and accessories. When she wasn't traveling, she was living in high-end hotels in and around Washington, D.C., using her actual apartment as little more than a walk-in closet for her ill-gotten wardrobe. But it was later revealed that roughly $272,000 went to a lawyer in Austria who Williams paid to forge documents to make her scam appear legitimate. The law eventually caught up with Williams, who ultimately pleaded guilty to 14 fraud-related counts in 2015. She traded in her designer duds for a prison uniform, which she'll be wearing until she finishes serving a 15.5-year prison sentence. Would you rather hit a $1 million windfall and lose it all to scammers and bad investments, or see someone else become a multimillionaire off an idea they got directly from you? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.